Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So I finally got my hands on a Steam Deck. But the funny thing is, this is not my Steam Deck. Funny story, right when the Steam Deck was available for pre-order, I was driving between two different work sites, and I was basically in the middle of a pineapple field. And I had terrible reception, and it took me about 15 minutes to place my order. And so because of that, I ended up being in the second quarter of pre-order sales. Now luckily, a friend of mine got into the first quarter sales, and he just got his last night. And amazingly, he offered to loan it to me for the first week so that I could make a couple videos about it. So I'm gonna leave him anonymous, but huge shout out to him for helping me out with this. This is really awesome. And I really hope that in this week of testing, I'm going to be able to do some really unique things with this device. I'm still trying to figure out how I'm actually going to approach the rest of this week, but this video here is going to be my first impressions, and I'm going to take a deep dive into all of the hardware aspects of the device. So we're going to get into the size and the weight, and then all of the buttons and controls and everything else like that. And then I'll make a couple other videos about things like software, and then of course retro game emulation. And so if you're concerned that the Steam Deck is too big or too heavy, or maybe the buttons aren't placed perfectly, we're going to try to answer all of that in this here video. And so without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, so I'm going to go pretty quick through the whole unboxing thing here. I do want to make note that it does come with its own charging brick. It's 45 watts, and it feels pretty high quality. Now each of the pre-orders do come with their own carrying case, as you can see here. And I gotta say, I'm really impressed with the carrying case right out of the gate. I would say this is a legit carrying case. The liner inside is both thick and sturdy. Personally, I think if you were to throw the Steam Deck into the case here, it's gonna be well protected. To put it into perspective, I would expect to pay something like $50 to $75 for a case like this. It's really nice. It also comes with a microfiber cloth, which is a nice touch. Now this thing is big, the biggest handheld I've ever used. But just how big is it? Let's do some comparisons against popular handhelds. Here is the Nintendo Switch OLED edition, and here is the regular Nintendo Switch. And finally, this is how it looks against the Nintendo Switch Lite. So all three of these handhelds are dwarfed by the Steam Deck. Similarly, the Sony PSP is just tiny. It's smaller than the Steam Deck screen. And despite having a 5-inch screen, the PS Vita also looks much smaller than the Steam Deck. Other comparisons here, here's the Red Magic 7, which is a modern Android smartphone wrapped around with a GameSir X2 controller. This is a pretty big setup, and it's still much smaller than the Steam Deck. Similarly, here's an iPhone 11 with the Backbone controller. So let's talk about some of the other dedicated handhelds that I've reviewed on this channel. Here's the GPD XP. This is essentially a smartphone wrapped around with interchangeable controls. This one is quite big as well, but again, looks tiny here. Same thing with the AYN Odin Pro. The Odin is just small enough to fit in my shorts pockets, but it's not very comfortable. And so I've always called this device portable, but not pocketable. And it makes me want to call the Steam Deck travel-friendly, but not portable. Really, when it comes to size, the only big comparables that I have are going to be the other handheld Windows PC. Here's the Aya Neo Retro Power 2021 version. It has a similar size screen, but a much smaller shell. In their most recent one, the Aya Neo Next was the largest handheld I'd ever used, up until today with this Steam Deck here. So yeah, it's a chunky boy. It's almost comically big against the other retro handhelds that I primarily focus on in this channel, something like the Anbernic RG351P. This one has a 3.5-inch display, but it looks like it's about an eighth of the size of the Steam Deck. In fact, the Steam Deck is almost as tall as a vertical handheld, like the RG351V here. Even some of my other retro handhelds that are 5 inches or larger in display, things like the RGB10 Max 2, or the Odroid Go Super, or even the latest Anbernic device, the RG552, are still quite small, which is funny because when I actually hold these and there's no other context, they're large handhelds. And so yes, I would say the Steam Deck is in a completely different class when it comes to those other pocketable handhelds that you typically would find on a channel like mine. And this isn't to say that the Steam Deck is too big, it's just that it's not a good comparison against basically anything else in the market. And I think those two classes of handhelds have different use cases. One of these you would just grab to take out in town, like when you're running errands. But something like the Steam Deck is going to have a use case of its own, and we'll explore that in a later video too. Now the device feels heavy, but it also feels well balanced in the hands. It's one of those experiences where the sheer volume of the thing actually helps to distribute the weight in a way that's more comfortable. But that being said, it is not a light device. For context, most modern controllers are going to be under 300 grams each. You can see that here with the PS5 or an Xbox Series controller. and the Steam Deck is 674 grams, so it's over twice as heavy as a regular controller. By comparison, it's almost twice the weight of the AYN Odin, and even 250 grams more than the Switch OLED edition. In fact, even after adding a 2000 series PS Vita, the Steam Deck is still heavier than these. Of course, if you add a 1000 series PS Vita, you will finally get to a weight that's more than the Steam Deck. Now, despite being quite a bit smaller than the Steam Deck, the Aya 2021 edition is actually only a little bit lighter. And the Aya Neo Next is actually almost 100 grams heavier than the Steam Deck. And so I do think that's a testament to how the weight is well distributed on this Steam Deck. Yes, it's a heavy device, but it doesn't feel as heavy as it is. Okay, let's talk about how the device actually feels. We'll start with the D-pad as always. Now this has a glossy 4-point D-pad as you can see here, and it does have a rubber membrane connection. I would say the amount of travel here is about on par with a classic retro system. So in that regard, I think it is going to be good for quick tactile controls. When it comes to the resistance of the button itself, I would say it's definitely more on the spectrum of being mushy than clicky. And while it does feel fairly precise when it comes to playing platformers, there is just a tiny bit of looseness in there as well. Now the D-pad itself does pivot, which I think will be beneficial when it comes to playing something like a fighting game, but one of my major concerns was the fact that the D-pad is so close to the edge of the device. I was worried my thumb was just going to slip right off while playing, and it turns out that is not a concern at all. In fact, the fact that your hand wraps around the rest of the device really keeps your thumb in place here. If I had one complaint, it would be the sheer glossiness of the D-pad itself. Even though the edges do flare out, I found that the D-pad is just too slick. And so as a result, when I'm doing diagonals, sometimes my fingers will slip just a little bit. Not a huge complaint, but I do wish it had a little bit of a grittier texture to it. Now, one thing I do appreciate is the size. This thing is over 21 millimeters altogether, and that's very close to a full-size D-pad. If you compare it to something like the Nintendo Switch Lite at 18 millimeters, it's like night and day difference. The Switch Lite D-pad starts to feel comically small. For context, the D-pad on the Super Nintendo was around 23 millimeters altogether, and the Switch Pro controller is almost the exact same size D-pad, about 21.5 millimeters. The closest I found in a comparison of D-pads is actually the Xbox One controller. This one's a little bit bigger, but also has that same kind of slick quality and flared edges. So if you have one of these laying around, you can play around with this and get a feel for what it'll be like. Now in a similar vein, the face buttons on the Steam Deck also remind me of an Xbox One controller. Partially that's because the buttons are glossy and rounded, but they have that same kind of feel to them as well. They're nice and responsive and don't take a lot of effort to push down on. These are the kind of buttons I feel like I could press down on a million times and it would still be great even a million times later. And much like with the D-pad, I was a little bit worried that the buttons themselves were a little bit too far to the right edge of the device itself. But it turns out the same context applies here as well. Because the entirety of your hand naturally wraps around the grip itself, it kind of makes it so that your thumb sticks just about straight up as you're holding it. And so because of that, the buttons themselves are really well positioned. This is one of those times where it looks really weird on paper, but when you actually have it in the hand, it makes a lot of sense. In terms of size, we're looking at about 8.5 millimeters altogether. Now compare that against a classic controller like a Super Nintendo, which is at 10.2. Or the tiny little buttons on Nintendo Switch, which are only less than 7 millimeters. At the end of the day, the Steam Deck face buttons feel just a tiny bit smaller than something like the PS5 or the Xbox Series buttons. So overall, no complaints with the face buttons. They're a great size and are really well positioned. And no surprises here, the analog sticks are also built a lot like a modern controller too. In fact, they even have a flared base like they do on an Xbox controller. And that's probably the best comparison I can make as well. These do feel a lot like the analog sticks on an Xbox controller. They've got a good amount of travel and springiness to them. And surprisingly, they're not recessed in any way. I think that does take away from its portability altogether, but the fact that they stick out so much from the case does give you a level of control that you typically wouldn't experience with a regular portable handheld. Often when using a retro handheld, something like the Anbernic devices which have recessed joysticks, there's always a compromise when it comes to the overall feel, especially if you're playing like a twin-stick shooter. But in this context, with the Steam Deck, I don't feel that at all. In fact, this feels a lot like a console-like experience. So again, full marks for these analog sticks. And just to be thorough, let's measure these as well. A little bit over 15 millimeters, which again is about a millimeter smaller than an Xbox controller. And these DualSense analog sticks are quite a bit bigger than I remember them being on the PS4, and so they're 2 millimeters bigger than the Steam Deck. And as always, coming in dead last when it comes to like portable feel and everything, the Nintendo Switch one is quite small. Now let's talk about these trackpads because I was really curious about these in the first place. Now these stick out a little bit from the shell itself, and that's because they can push down just a little bit. That's something I didn't realize when first looking at pictures of the Steam Deck. But I think it's better to talk about the trackpads when an actual game is running, so we'll test these more later. But let's talk about some of the other buttons on the device. At the top left, there's what they call the View button, which kind of functions as a select button here. This button is super small and also quite mushy. And then below the trackpad is another button here, which they're just calling the Steam button. This one is flush with the case and also does not have any travel to it at all. In fact, it's very hard to tell when you're pushing down on this button. I think they did it this way so you wouldn't accidentally press down on it. Also on the left side is one of the stereo speakers. Now up on the top right, there is another small button here, like on the left. This one they call the Menu button, and it functions like a start as well. And like with the other, this one's very small and mushy. Now opposite of the Steam button is something here called the Quick Access button. This one's also flush and has very little travel too. Now unfortunately, there is no charging port here on the bottom of the device. The only thing you have along the bottom is an SD card slot. Up top, we have two volume buttons, a headphone jack, and also an exhaust vent for the internal fan. This is where you will find the single USB-C port and then the power button too. The volume buttons themselves are the clickiest buttons on this device and definitely feel like the cheapest of any of the other buttons. Now this USB-C port here is a full port, so you can do charging as well as data connections here. There's also a white LED indicator light when you're charging the device itself. The power button also functions as a sleep button, and it's a tiny bit recessed into the case itself, and so I don't think you'll ever accidentally press this button, especially if it's like in your book bag or something else like that. And finally, up top, let's talk about these shoulder and trigger buttons. Now the shoulder buttons have a pretty cool design to them, which is reminiscent of, yes, you guessed it, an Xbox controller. These also have a similar amount of clickiness as an Xbox controller. They feel a little bit like a mouse click, but with a deeper sound, and it does require a little bit more effort than a mouse. And it seems to be about the same amount of resistance no matter where you push the button. I honestly think these are pretty good shoulders. Now thankfully this handheld uses analog triggers. This is going to be really handy for racing games and things like that. And these feel nice and sturdy too. I think the resistance here is just about perfect. But I do feel like the travel could be a little bit more. It just doesn't seem to have as wide of a range of motion as it does with other controllers. Here on an Xbox controller you can see the amount of travel is quite a bit more. I would say maybe 10-20% more here. And same thing with the PS5 controller, this seems to have a larger range of motion. This is a good time to talk about the overall plastic of the device. As you can see here, it has a gritty kind of texture to it. And while that does make it very nice for gripping, it does pick up a little bit of fingerprints, as you can see. There's also the fan intake here on the back. Now it also has 4 function buttons on the back. These can be assigned to whatever you want within SteamOS. And these take a lot of effort to push down on, especially compared to the rest of the device. And due to the way that they're positioned, your fingers will always be resting on these buttons. But they sit mostly flush with the device itself, and because they take a good amount of effort to actually push down on, I think it's going to be very rare that you accidentally press down on them. In fact, most of the time I just forget that they're in the first place. And these have a dull clickiness to them, kind of similar to the shoulder buttons, but with even deeper of a sound. Now, the device's ergonomics are through the roof. The fact that they have such chunky grips like this feels very, very comfortable to me. There's room for every one of my fingers. My index fingers will rest on the trigger buttons, and then I have space for the other 3 fingers right below it. There's no sense of cramping or anything else. I would say by far this is the best ergonomics of any handheld I've ever used, and it comes second only to a dedicated controller like an Xbox controller. Now that being said, there seems to be quite a bit of distance between the trackpads and the rest of the controls. In fact, it makes you have to pivot your wrist in order to access the trackpad and then jump up to the face buttons. And it's a tiny little thing, but that amount of travel that you're going to have to do with your thumb is going to feel a little bit awkward in some cases, as I'll show later on when I try to play a first-person shooter game using the right thumbstick. And the only other moment where I've observed something that's a little bit awkward is when I try to push the view or the menu buttons. And that's because these things are so small and tucked away so high up on the device that it does take quite a bit of effort to get your thumb up there. Now granted, these are 2 buttons you're not going to press very often. It's not like you're going to need to quick pause or anything else like that. But all the same, these are a little bit further from where my thumbs naturally rest than I'd like. But I think those are minor complaints. At the end of the day, everything feels very easy to access. The shoulders and triggers especially feel very natural just because your index finger is going to naturally want to rest on top of them. And getting to the D-pad, analog sticks, and face buttons, all that's really handy. To highlight just how good these ergonomics are, I'm going to bring out the Neo Next one more time. Now this one has a different design. It's more like a souped up Nintendo Switch. And it does have grips, but they're relatively small. And so instead of cupping your hands around the grips, they're just kind of there to help you spread your fingers across the back of the device. The shoulder buttons on the Neo Next also have quite a bit more travel, and they feel a little bit cheap by comparison. But I do really like the amount of travel in the triggers on the Next here. They're just kind of like these big flappy triggers, and I like that. And I do have to say that the thumbsticks on the Neo Next are top notch. I still think these are better than on the Steam Deck. They seem to roll around a little bit more naturally and just give me more precise control. But I would say, despite the lack of travel, the Steam Deck triggers are better than the Neo ones. And of course, there's no comparison against something like the Nintendo Switch. These tiny little triggers aren't even analog, and the whole Switch experience just feels like really tiny and clicky. Like I'm only using the very tips of my thumbs when I'm pressing down on something. And of course, the range of motion on the analog sticks are nowhere near like the Steam Deck or the Neo Next. But of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. My oldest son loves playing his Switch in handheld mode, and so I had him test out the Steam Deck for a little bit. And while he did admit that he liked the big screen and he thought it was a comfortable handheld, he thought that the device was too wide and that the buttons were too far spread apart. In fact, he said he would rather use the Switch than the Steam Deck. But me personally, I'm Steam Deck all the way. This thing is so comfortable to hold. Every time I pick it up, I just look forward to just having it in the hands. The way that the D-pad and the face buttons are positioned are just supremely comfortable. I could play this thing for hours on end. But when I first started up a game, what caught my attention weren't the controls. It was the audio. Let's take a listen real quick. It's probably not coming through as well as I would like it to, but the audio on this is absolutely fantastic. In fact, this is many leagues better than any other handheld I've ever tried before. As I first started playing this, I kept thinking the same thing, in that the speakers here were so far above its weight class that it was ridiculous. It's almost like the carrying case that comes with this thing. It's way better than it needs to be, but I appreciate it so much. The same thing with these speakers. They're super immersive, they get nice and loud, and they're very, very clear. Valve did not need to make such nice speakers, and I'm absolutely speechless that they pulled this off at this price point. So if you're a fan of game audio, you are in for a treat. This is incredible. Okay, back to controls. When I'm actually playing a game, say something like Hades here, where I'm using the left analog stick and the face buttons, it feels very natural and good. And while I do think that the Neo Next has better analog controls, and it'd probably be more comfortable to play, say, on like a dedicated Xbox controller, those are the only two contexts where it's better than the Steam Deck. But other than those two contexts, the Steam Deck is better than anything else I've tried. So just because there is something better doesn't mean that this isn't fantastic. And sometimes it's actually even better. For example, a twin-stick shooter is better on this than it is on the Neo Next. And that has to do with the grips themselves. Because you're able to wrap your whole hands around it, using the dual analog stick controls like this is a real treat. So now let's talk about those trackpads. Now I think it does depend on the game, but with most games it's going to default to just mimicking the D-pad controls. And at first I thought this is just a total gimmick, right? Like, why do I need to use a trackpad when I have a D-pad that's already there? But something that I didn't quite realize until I had it in the hands and I was moving my thumb around is the fact that sliding your thumb across a trackpad actually feels a lot more natural and intuitive than a D-pad in some contexts. So think about it this way, when you press a D-pad on the left and then you press it on the right, the whole thing kind of pivots along with your thumb. But when you press down on this trackpad and do the same thing, it's more like a natural sliding motion. And I don't know why, but that seems to make me connect more with the character on the screen. I would say it's not quite as precise as the D-pad, but it was a really nice feeling, to the point where it felt like a brand new experience, which is kind of rare when you play a lot of games. And so I think this is something I'm going to explore in the future, is playing through a whole game using just the trackpad on the left side. Because I think if you find the right combination of a game that works well with this setup, and you train your thumb to get a little bit more precise with this new input method, this might be a game changer in some contexts. Now I don't want to sell this too much here, because there are contexts where it doesn't work very well at all. For example, in twin-stick shooter games like Doom Eternal, the trackpad can function as your right analog stick. But if you leave it at the default settings for the analog sticks on the trackpad, you're you're going to spend a lot of time kind of swiping your thumb across and then picking it up and moving it and things like that. But if you increase the sensitivity, it starts to feel like it's moving too much. And so it's hard to find that balance between the two. And so maybe with a lot of practice, there are going to be people out there who do find that they can use the trackpad with a twin stick shooter game like this. But personally, I did not find it as precise as using an analog joystick. And this is probably one of the most subjective parts of this video here, because other people may prefer to use this kind of control setup. But personally, I like to use analog sticks with first-person shooters, and to me, this was a worse experience. So anyway, that's about it for this video here. I just wanted to show off how it feels to actually play a Steam Deck in your hands. And I'll be sure to make other videos later this week that are more about the actual gameplay itself, tweaking the settings, running retro emulation, all that other stuff. But first and foremost, I thought it was most important to address whether or not you're going to actually enjoy holding the Steam Deck. And I would say, in terms of ergonomics and comfort, yes, I think most people are going to really enjoy holding the Steam Deck in their hands. It is heavy, but not too heavy. The weight is really well balanced. And despite having some minor ergonomic problems, overall this is the most comfortable and best high quality feeling of any handheld I've used to date. And that's not a statement I make lightly. I mean, I've tested probably 100 different devices at this point. And if I only had to choose one to sit on the couch and play with, right now, the Steam Deck would be at the top of that list. Now, in terms of portability, that's a different story. I think you really need to know what you're getting into when it comes to buying a Steam Deck. This is not the kind of handheld I would recommend taking out with you when you're running errands. And that's for several reasons. Number one, the battery life on this is not super long. You can get maybe 2 to 4 hours altogether. And if you're going to walk around a grocery store playing this thing, some nerd is going to walk up and snatch this right out of your hands because they got a third quarter reservation. In all seriousness, this thing is just a little bit too big to be what I would call portable. But for example, if you were going on a trip, maybe a road trip, or you were going to go and fly and visit your parents for Thanksgiving, in that context, you're definitely going to want to have the Steam Deck with you. And I think if you want to sit around on the couch and play around, this is going to be a great fit too. It's a little bit too big and heavy to hold above your head while laying in bed, but I think in almost every other context within your house, you're going to love it. And so yes, I think the Steam Deck is big and heavy and not very portable. But it is super comfortable, it's a joy to play, and while it may not be portable, it is definitely travel friendly. Anyway, that's about it for this video here. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'm still figuring out what Steam Deck videos I'm going to make in the future, so let me know in the comments what you want to see. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.